Hello and welcome to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. At this time, please silence all electronic devices. I'm Aisling Stanek, a sophomore politics and philosophy major and a Kevin Harrington student ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of St. Anselm College and the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, we would like to thank you for joining us for tonight's program with Dr. Elaine Kamarck. Dr. Kamarck received a PhD in political science at the University of California, Berkeley. She was a founding member of the New Democratic Movement, which helped elect President Bill Clinton to office. Dr. Kamarck went on to work for the Clinton administration in 2000 and the Gore campaign. She then served in the White House as a manager of the Clinton administration's National Performance Review and later served as the senior policy advisor on the Gore campaign. Dr. Kamarck has authored 3 books: How Change Happens or Doesn't, The Politics of U.S. Public Policy, The End of Government as We Know It, Making Public Policy Work, and Primary Politics, How Presidential Candidates Have Shaped the Modern Nominating System. Throughout Dr. Kamarck's extensive political career, she has taught at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, inspiring the next generation of politicians. She currently serves as a senior fellow in the Governance Study Program at Brookings and is the founding director of the Center for Effective Public Management. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elaine Kamarck.
Thank you very much, Aisling, and thank you to the Institute here. I was kind of present at the creation because I was at the Kennedy School, and I know that you all came and spent some time with Kathy and learned a little bit and then put your own twist on things. It's a great place you have up here. You should feel very lucky to have this institute in your midst. I'd like to also recognize the chairman of the New Hampshire Democratic Party, Mr. Chairman Buckley. Thank you for joining us today, who I serve with on the Rules Committee of the Democratic National Committee. And in the back, I have some books for sale, but one of them, which is dear to my heart, is called Primary Politics, and it is about presidential politics and something that I know everybody in New Hampshire knows an awful lot about. And so that's why I'm here today, but not to talk about presidential politics, but to talk about the Primaries Project. Now, here's what that is. I decided when I took over the new institute at Brookings last year that one of our missions was to try and look at the sources of political polarization and political dysfunction in American politics. And I went right to primaries and said, we've got to understand better what's happening in primaries. Because as you will remember, in 2010, this little group that nobody thought was very important, the Tea Party, emerged like a shot out of those primaries. And nobody really saw it coming, particularly people in the Republican Party. And so I feel that as a political scientist, it was very important to understand better what goes on in congressional primaries. We have studied presidential primaries a lot. I've studied them. There's other scholars in the field that have studied them. We actually know something about voters in presidential primaries. We know nothing about congressional primaries. Nothing. They are not exit polled. You can't even really do a reliable poll after the fact because turnout is so low that to even find a primary voter would be extraordinarily expensive. You'd have to go through who knows how many panels before you could find somebody who voted in the primary. And then, of course, you'd have to actually believe that they voted in the primary, which is a kind of another story. So we don't know much about congressional primaries. And so when we had this mission at Brookings to look at causes of political dysfunction and political polarization, I decided that at least we should start looking at the 2014 primaries and start looking at least at the actual races. Who is running in these primaries? Normally, the press will cover a handful of primaries. It's usually a primary where there's somebody who's gotten in a scandal, somebody like Ralph Hall in Texas who was just really old and the voters finally said, time to go. Scandals, age, things like that generally knock off incumbents in primaries. But most of the time, we don't even pay attention to primaries. The press doesn't, the political world doesn't, and consequently, the voters don't. Turnout in a congressional primary can be as low as 5%. 5% of the voting age population. Turnout in statewide primaries averages around 20%, but the congressional primaries are much, much smaller because there's fall off. Sometimes you'll have a big governor's race or something like that that'll draw out voters. People won't even bother to vote in the congressional primaries. So we said it's about time we start moving the scholarly world and the political world towards paying a lot more attention to what goes on in primaries. And so we started in March with looking at every single candidate in primaries in the 2014 cycle. The only ones we excluded were candidates who were so minor that they could not qualify for the ballot in the state, or they did not register with the Federal Election Commission. Okay, so that took out some, but we looked at everyone else. And here's who we looked at. Let's see. One of these will work. Why is this not doing this? Sorry about this. Technology always does this to me.
Just click out of this.
I tried this and that didn't work either. There we go. Which one did you, that one? Okay. We looked at over 1,000 candidates, 1,662 candidates. 719 were Democrats, 896 were Republicans, and there were 47 sort of other candidates who were not identified by party, but who ran in the nonpartisan primaries in California, Washington, and Alaska. So that was our universe. This is the first time any universe this big of congressional candidates has been looked at. As you can see, however, not many House incumbents faced primary challengers, and this is percentages. So in 2014, 36% of House incumbents faced primary challengers. That's a typo. In 2012, it was 49%. And in the previous years, it was less. So in the last 3 cycles, we have had, in fact, more challengers in congressional primaries. You can see that in 2004, we just took a decade as our unit of measurement. In 2004, it was only 22%, 20 or 23% if you round up, of candidates. So that means out of 435 House members, only 100 basically even got a challenger. And of course, many of those challengers are not very serious. You can also see from this chart that at least in 2014, most of the challengers come on the Republican side, more so than on the Democratic side. And that's quite consistent with the narrative of this election, which is the Republicans are in the middle of a civil war, and the Democrats are kind of having a sleepy affair this year. And the other thing that pretty much holds true is incumbents don't really lose very much. We had total of four House incumbents lose in primaries this year. The big one, of course, which everyone made a fuss about, was Eric Cantor in Virginia because he was part of the party leadership. But basically, there's really, incumbents don't lose. In 2012, by the way, these numbers tend to go up a little bit. That's the first district first election after redistricting. So you always get more turn in those elections. But as you can see, not many people get challenged, and very few House incumbents lose primaries. Nonetheless, over 1,500 intrepid souls got themselves out there and actually ran in the 2014 primaries. So let's look at who they were. We had a team of coders who looked at everybody's websites, and from their websites looked at their endorsements, okay? And we divided the Democratic Party into 3 generic groups: progressive Dems, establishment Dems, moderate Dems. In spite of the sort of talk that between Elizabeth Warren and Bill de Blasio, there's a resurgence of progressive or left of center action in the Democratic Party, we didn't find that much of it in these primaries. About a quarter of the Democrats running were identifying themselves as progressive, more progressive than, say, President Obama and the House leadership. Most of the Democrats identified themselves as establishment Democrats, and a few, it was a small number as you can see, identified themselves as moderate Democrats. These are often Democrats running in swing seats or in Republican-leaning kinds of districts, and they're trying to put a little distance between themselves and the Democratic Party. Republicans. Here we had more divisions. Obviously, the top 2 was where all the story was this year. Business and establishment Republicans were the most frequent kinds of Republicans running. Second was the Tea Party and conservative Republicans. Conservative Republicans were people who lauded their conservative credentials but shied away from identifying as a Tea Party sympathizer, and who did not get endorsements from Tea Party groups. So while, frankly, all of these Republicans, as I'll get to in a minute, look a lot alike, okay, on the issues. You'll see that. The ones that we classified as Tea Party were the ones who rather proudly wore the label or received money from one of the explicit Tea Party PACs, et cetera. And I want to point that out because, in fact, on an issues continuum, these folks look pretty much alike. What have they been talking about? Okay, so this is what we started then to look at the various issues in this campaign. And not surprisingly, the candidates in the 2 parties talk about pretty much different things. The one thing they all talked about was Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. 62% of the Democrats running had something on their website, a speech, a statement, something, and 78%, actually, if you round that up, 79% of the Republicans. This was a big issue. For the Democrats, the second most popular issue was climate change. Note that it doesn't make the top 5 on the Republican list. I mean, they just don't talk about it. The third most popular issue for the Democrats was raising the minimum wage. Again, this does not show up in the Republican top 5 list. The fourth is immigration. This does show up on the Republican list. And the fifth for Democrats were taxes. It too shows up. It's number 2 on the Republican list. So what you get by looking at this list is a sense of 2 different parties and 2 different internal conversations, okay, talking about different issues to their core supporters, the people who vote in primaries. Okay, let's see. Okay, so that's where we are on an overall look. Let me talk a little bit about some of the things that we then found from this. First of all, let's go to immigration. Not surprisingly, on immigration, the level of immigration opposition to immigration reform in the Republican Party was pretty intense, okay? However, it was mediated a little bit in certain Republican districts. So if the Republican district was a rural agricultural district, the Republican candidates tended not to be quite as hardline against immigration reform as other Republican candidates. An example, for instance, North Carolina Congressional District 7, the winner was a man named David Reuser, a former state senator, and a former agriculture official, an agriculture lobbyist, and a congressional aide. And his website said that he supports a system that allows employers and their undocumented workers to get on track to a legal workforce. So what we found pretty much across the board is that Republicans representing farm districts tended to be much more open, because that's their labor force, et cetera, tended to be much more open to comprehensive immigration reform than other Republicans. Also, when we looked in these numbers, we find that of the Republican groups, the Tea Party activists, the ones identified with the Tea Party, are most virulently against any kind of comprehensive immigration reform. They really stake out the extremes of that. And not surprisingly, the business establishment Republicans are a little bit more open to compromise. So if you're looking down the road and you say to yourself, well, what do we think might happen in this next Congress on immigration reform? One of the things you want to look at is you want to look at the farm members of the Republican caucus. What are they like? What are they thinking about? Will they have some effect on their leadership? Will there be a potential for a deal with the Democrats? Not surprisingly, on the Democratic side, okay, everyone who expressed an opinion on immigration reform expressed an opinion absolutely in favor of comprehensive immigration reform, although about half of the Democrats simply didn't mention it at all, okay, which was not unusual for a lot of the Democratic candidates that we found. On the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's called in many circles, liberal Democrats felt freer to depart from the party line. On Obamacare, you had a lot of liberal Democrats expressing a kind of more nuanced position. Some of them wanted a public option. Some of them wanted a single-payer system. In other words, there's a little bit more nuance as opposed to just yes or no. On the Republican side, there's no nuance at all when it comes to the health care, all right? 78%, huge number, all these candidates, they're all for repeal Obamacare. This is quite consistent with a party that has now voted over 50 times in the House of Representatives to repeal Obamacare. So their candidates, no matter how they're identified, right, whether they're a business-type establishment or a Tea Party, all their candidates are absolutely opposed to Obamacare and would like to see it repealed. So while on immigration you have maybe a little bit of an opening on the Republican side, on health care you have a little bit of an opening for some perhaps changes on the Democratic side. On health care you have a Republican Party that is in fact in lockstep on this issue of repealing the Affordable Care Act. And that, I think, does not bode well for all of the adjustments that may need to be made to this act, which, by the way, need to be made to any act this big as it moves through its implementation. When it comes to the big issues of economics, jobs, et cetera, it was interesting that both parties seem to be stuck in a distant past. The Democrats are all about Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, all about it. Every ad, it's all about protect Social Security, protect Medicare. That's what where the Democrats are. That's the bulk of their issue positions on their websites. That's almost all the advertising that we looked at. That's where they are, protect Social Security and Medicare. The only non-sort of New Deal issue that comes up was, of course, protection of women's reproductive rights. And that is obviously a big hot issue for the Democratic base. It's also obviously trying to take advantage of Republican stumbles in this area, which we saw in stark relief in 2012, where they had a lot of embarrassing Republican candidates, cost them some Senate seats. So Democrats obviously are trying to remind voters of that. On the Republican side, it's all about lower taxes and less regulation. Okay, almost in lockstep, right across all the different kinds of Republicans. It's like they were all trying to channel Ronald Reagan once again. So it's interesting that you have such a kind of back to the future about this race, right? With both parties going back to their most fundamental roots in the primaries. On the Democratic side, this is particularly important because a lot of Democrats have very little to say about issues. In fact, what they do is they're trying to engage in identity politics. I'm African American, I'm a woman, I understand you, et cetera. They're making very personal appeals. The contrast to the Republican candidates is quite stark here. The Republican candidates are making straight-on ideological appeals. It's almost like one party is up here talking about big issues, and another party is here trying to talk about very personal, person-to-person connective things. It's interesting to ask why there's so little fight on the Democratic side. When we started this, I thought, well, there would be more discussion about health care, or there would be more discussion about national security issues and wiretapping and privacy issues. I thought we'd see a little bit more of that on the Democratic side. In fact, there isn't very much. I think the simplest explanation is probably that given how strongly Democrats feel about this president, they've been loath to do anything that might look like they're criticizing the president, because for all his trouble, the president has maintained very strong feelings among his base. So that may be one of the things that's going on here. But the Democratic side is particularly quiet. In fact, one of the journalists wrote a column on this topic and asked, are the Democrats on Xanax? Because there was so little going on on the Democratic side. The other interesting observation is wars? What wars? What wars? Nobody is talking about national security. We saw this early on. The Republicans in Washington throughout this primary season have tried and tried and tried to make an issue of Benghazi. Obviously, they're trying to soften up Hillary Clinton, should she run in 2016. So, you barely see one of the Republican leaders in Congress that he's not trying to do a Benghazi hearing or talk about Benghazi. Benghazi doesn't appear in the primary campaigns of Republicans. Obviously, it wouldn't in Democrats. It doesn't appear among the Republicans. It's like it's not there. And I have to think that part of that has to do with the fact that it just doesn't work. People don't know what it is. It's just not relevant. But more important is that candidates in both parties completely ignore the world on the other side of the ocean. And remember, during this period of time, we had the Soviets and the Russians and Ukraine, right? We had Syria blowing up, we have Iraq, we have ISIL, all this stuff's going on. It was a big foreign policy year. Foreign policy is very much in the news, and yet nobody talks about it. One of the people working with us said during the early days of the Cold War, it was an article of faith that politics stops at the water's edge. Judging from the 2014 primaries in both parties, interest in global issues now stops at the water's edge. So for anybody looking to see where the next Congress might go on one of these issues, the primaries tells us very, very little at all. Finally, on the Democratic side, the Democrats were kind of the opposite of Lake Wobegon. Okay, you know Lake Wobegon, everybody's above average. Well, in the Democratic primaries, everybody's income, at least when they were growing up, was below average. Hardship narratives were totally common in the Democratic primary, as they were in even the proletarian novels of the 1930s. A candidate in Hawaii for the Congressional District 1 ran a web video in which her mother talked about the candidate's childhood. Nobody had hot water. Hot water was a luxury, and if you had hot water, you were more high class. A candidate in Arizona began his opening statement in a TV debate by declaring, "I am running for the American dream. I was a very lucky man. I grew up poor. I didn't have a bed until I got to college." And this narrative, the narrative of struggle, the narrative of coming from behind, the narrative of poverty, interestingly enough, runs through a lot of these Democratic sites. I must say that the team that was coding these got a little, after seeing, the hundredth of these, got a little skeptical that so many people were really that poor. But on the other hand, but there's obviously no way for us to know that or check that. But it was a feature of the Democratic sites, just like the sort of lockstep ideological issue positions were a feature of the Republican sites. So you have in 2014 two parties and two very different stories, clearly as polarized as they ever were, although with perhaps on some of these issues a little bit of sliver of hope that there might be some room for compromise. You have a Republican Party that is really about ideology and a Democratic Party that is really about group identification as opposed to ideology. It doesn't have an ideological overtones. You have the predominance of incumbents running and winning. But, and here's an important but, we do see in 2014 a slight reduction in the margins by which incumbents are winning. Most of that is driven by the Republicans, but some occurs on the Democratic side too. Now, those of you who know anything about congressmen know that there's a famous book in political science called Unsafe at Any Margin. And what it refers to the fact that no matter how many elections they've won and how big their wins are, it is kind of in the brain of a member of Congress to always be nervous about reelection. And so if in fact what we saw is a slight dip, I don't want to overstate it, but a slight dip in margins over the last 10 years, and that obviously would have two effects. One is if you're a Republican and you're looking at the huge number of Tea Party challengers that came out this year, and you're looking at perhaps a reduced margin, you may not be a Tea Partier, you may not be part of that coalition, et cetera, but guess what? You're going to be always looking to see what did they do, what are they talking about, and you don't want to make them mad because your margin has slipped a little bit. You know that there's an awful lot of energy out there. If you're a Democrat, the sort of challengers to the Democrats were not as big as they were on the Republican side. The Democrats are a very unified, if you look at these elections, they're a very unified party. But it does make you wonder about 2016. It does make you wonder if in 2016, Democrats are going to have to get beyond protect Social Security and Medicare as the challenges move up with the presidential election. So it does make you wonder, what is that debate going to look like in 2016? And are Democrats going to be up for that debate? One final word on money. The big change in money this year, and we, as part of our primaries project, we had the Campaign Finance Institute track the money, and they did a very important thing. They tracked all the outside money. And what they find is a little bit contrary to conventional wisdom. Outside money actually decreased this time to everybody's surprise. On the other hand, within the Republican Party, most of the big increase in outside money came from the business establishment, most especially the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce got in there and they played really, really hard. And from what we can tell, they played a smart game. They invested heavily in races where they wanted to protect a business type, either incumbent or a challenger, from a Tea Party assault, and they tended to have a pretty good win record. A lot of the storyline about the Tea Party losing races has to do with the Chamber of Commerce being in there on the side of business and establishment Republicans, pouring lots of money in there. So that's kind of the new storyline. It is borne out in the numbers. On the Democratic side, there isn't much new money. It tends to be leadership PACs. You know, it tends to be kind of, there's nothing very new about the Democratic story. Again, we looked at this not in terms of who's going to win and who's going to lose, right? That's the usual way of looking at primaries. We looked at this to say, what's going on in the two parties that run our country? And what do the conversations in those parties tell us about the Congress of the future, perhaps the next presidential election? Are we going to get past this era of intense political polarization and actually get a Congress that can govern? That I don't have a lot of good news from this initial look at the primaries, although there are a couple of slivers of hope. So with that, I've talked plenty. Let me take your questions and your comments. Thank you. Yes?
I'd like to return to your slide you have here. You have about a 15-to-1 ratio of people applying. You have about a 15-to-1 ratio of people applying for jobs. So there's about 100 openings and about 1,600 people running. And so I'm going to make two assumptions. One is that if you are an incumbent, you're probably in better touch with your active voters than someone who's a challenger. And the second is that many challengers, in at least my experience, tend to be one or two policy, one or two issue kind of folks. If you were to filter out and just look at the priorities of the incumbents that are running, would the order of these change and might a different issue emerge?
That's a very good question. I might actually have to go home and do that, okay? But my instinct, having looked at this, is that they probably wouldn't change very much. That you know, some of these that are close, like taxes and debt, might change, et cetera. On the Republican side, it was so overwhelmingly about Obamacare that I'm not sure that taking a smaller look at this would change it. And there was a ton of intense interest on immigration. So, but it's a good point, and you're right. It might change those. It might change some of those a little bit. Notice, however, that jobs is not on there. Okay, and again, this is. It was interesting. My guess is because nobody really has a very good idea about how to actually create jobs. I mean, I think it's probably still the #1 issue in the voters' minds, but the two parties don't seem to have a lot of interesting things to say about it.
You might say that regulations, however, don't affect it.
Yes, that's right. Regulations, minimum wage on the Democratic side. I mean, and again, you can see the sources of polarization because they really talk. I mean, it's like it's two completely different conversations that the two parties are having. And so, not surprisingly, they don't have not a lot of places where they can agree when they get into Congress. Yes?
One of your earlier slides was about incumbents who are losing. I wondered if we're an anomaly here in New Hampshire. In District 1, we've got Shea Porter, Frank Ginta, Shea Porter. Ginta has now won the Republican primary. Are we the only ones that are contributing to the loss of incumbents by inserting somebody who served previously?
No, that tends to happen. That tends to happen in a lot of places. It particularly happens, yeah. And you know where you see it? You see it in the year after a redistricting. See, because in the year after redistricting, what happens is incumbents get thrown into the same district together. So you do tend to see that somewhat. The bottom line, though, is whether it's primaries or general elections, is incumbents simply don't lose. They just don't lose. I'm frankly not sure that that's really good for democracy, that people, once they get in there, can actually stay in there so long. I'm not sure this is really terrific, but boy, I'll tell you, there's not a lot of things in political science that say stay true for a long time. That's one of them. Yes.
In the recent primary, there was about a 3-to-1 turnout, Republican over Democrat. Shaheen was uncontested, Hassan 90% win, as opposed to Scott Brown in a somewhat competitive on the Republican side. Does that tell you much, the turnout 3-to-1, tell you much about going forward to November, how the turnout is going to be?
No, it doesn't really. If Shaheen had been in a contested primary, with a serious contest, then I think political professionals would look at the turnout in each primary. But let's face it, in uncontested primary, there's just not a lot of motivation for people to go out and vote. Even Obama, when he ran here in 2012, had really a very, very small turnout in the presidential. So it's hard to compare an uncontested to a contested primary. Now, we do see this all the time in presidential primaries, right? When you have a primary in both parties in the same state, particularly a state like New Hampshire, which is a swing state, people do pay a lot of attention. I'm sure Chairman Buckley pays a lot of attention to how many Republicans were out there voting, how many Democrats were out there voting. So you see that a lot, but it's hard when it's uncontested. Yes. You had a question? Yeah.
Well, that gets to that. Oh, thank you. Adding on to that, can you say anything about the enthusiasm gap and whether or not that what we saw here in New Hampshire in the primary might or might not translate into the general election, and what produces an enthusiasm gap?
Well, it's a complicated question, and mostly we know from presidential primaries. Again, congressional primaries are pretty unstudied business. I call them the ugly stepchild of election studies, because just nobody has really studied them. If I were to extrapolate from presidential elections, I would say that there are certain kinds of primaries that, in fact, invigorate the whole party. So clearly in 2008, the Obama and Hillary Clinton primary, which went on and on, Democrats were, myself included, were very worried about this. But the fact of the matter was that there were no really deep ideological fissures in that, and people tended to like both their candidates. So we saw increasing turnout in a lot of states. I mean, states like Indiana, okay? And in fact, those primaries, the energy in those primaries presaged some of the states that Obama won in 08 and 12 that, Democrats had never won before. So sometimes a primary can work to kind of get everybody's attention. There's one thing we know about voter turnout. If you have a good race, a good competitive race, guess what? You boost turnout. Okay, so primaries can work like that. On the other hand, I cut my political teeth many, many years ago in a primary that was the Carter-Kennedy primary in 1980. It was ugly. There was deep ideological divisions within the party. It was not a happy occasion, and I think it contributed to the huge loss that Jimmy Carter had in 1980. So there's a sense in which, and this is where you go to art, not science, right? That sometimes a primary, sometimes a good, great contest with good candidates and big ideas, et cetera. Sometimes it can help your party, sometimes it can doom them. And it's very hard to say a priori what it's going to be. Oh, there must be not. Yes.
I was just wondering, here in New Hampshire, we had a female Latina running in the Republican primary in the second district. I was just wondering if you happen to have looked at whether the Republican Party has done any more to recruit minority or female candidates, since that was part of their plan for this year.
We didn't see it. Now, one of the problems was we really couldn't code for race because, first of all, it wasn't like a, form. People didn't have to say on their website what the race was. We could sort of guess, et cetera. But we didn't really have a good sense of that. It didn't seem like there were an awful lot of Republican minority candidates. The one thing we could code for, because you could tell that easily on the websites, was sex. And quite consistent with the images of the two parties, there were a lot more female candidates on the Democratic side than on the Republican side. Okay. On the other hand, the women did equally well whether they were Democratic or Republican. So, that was kind of an interesting finding. More women candidates on the Democratic side, but of the women, they had equal success rates. And by the way, they did pretty well in both parties, which I thought was interesting. Both Republican women and Democratic women did pretty well. The other thing we looked at was whether or not the candidate had put military service on their website and talked about their military service. Slightly more Republicans than Democrats had military service, although the Democrats had set out this year to try to recruit Iraq and Afghan vets. So I think that what the parties try to do and what they end up being able to do is not always the same thing. The other problem with the Latino, the sort of come to Jesus moment for the Republicans is going to be 2016, because what they've got in their internal coalition, and we saw it so starkly here, is they have a faction that is big, that is powerful, that plays in primaries, that is absolutely against immigration reform. And that's got to be turning off Latino voters. There are plenty of Republican strategists who are saying, hello there, this is bad for us presidentially, but it's working for them in the off years. And so one of the things that's going on the Republican side is they've got a civil war that is really a proxy war for midterms versus presidential. Because a lot of the things that help them in midterms, and could even help them win the Senate this time, hurt them in the presidential year. And so you listen to Republican strategists in Washington, and they're just all over the place on this because they're torn between the near win, the prospect of maybe having a Republican Congress this time, and what they know is coming down the pike, which is a much tougher presidential race. And so it's a tough one, and the Latino vote is right at the center of that kind of schizophrenia in the Republican Party. Democrats are trying their best to just hold that vote, make that vote their own, make it a generational thing so that that vote keeps being that vote. The problem Democrats have is that no one can quite answer the following question yet. Are Latino Americans more like African Americans, or are they more like Italians? And that means, will they, in a generation or two, move to the suburbs, intermarry, and kind of celebrate Cinco de Mayo, but other than that, not have an identity? Whereas African Americans kept, and for some reasons not of their own control, right? I mean, they were segregated by housing and stuff. African Americans kept a distinctive identity through generations. And so for Democrats are doing pretty well with Latinos right now. But the question is this a permanent piece of the coalition in the way that African Americans are? Yes.
The Democrats are deferring the immigration issue until after the by-election. That's my sense.
Oh, of course they are, yeah. I mean, and Obama clearly indicated that. He had a package of immigration executive actions that he could take. He clearly moved back from that, and obviously will take some actions after the midterms. Now, the problem with that is that if he has an overwhelmingly Republican Congress, if he has a Republican Senate and Republican House, they can very well pass laws to negate his executive actions. So it's not a done deal. But if he keeps a divided Congress, if Democrats hold on, then I think, in fact, he's got some opportunity to make progress. I think the other thing to think about down the road is, depending on what the coalitions look like, right, is whether or not some combination of your business Republicans and these rural Republicans might, in fact, go to the leadership of their party and say, yes, so I know the Tea Party caucus is banging you around the head on this issue, but we need some action on this. So there's a little bit of a sliver of hope that some piece of the Republican caucus could, in fact, move on immigration reform. I wouldn't overstate it, but yes.
Speaking just about the incumbent, not the challenging party, were Republicans more likely to be challenged in their primaries than the
Yes.
Democrats? Gut feeling it was. But
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no. We show that quite clearly. I mean, Republicans, they have a fight going on in that party. And there were more challengers than there were to the Democrats. There were more challengers to incumbents. I mean, that party is going through something. They really are going through an identity crisis. And again, a lot has been made about the fact that the Tea Party didn't win a lot of races. Well, they've kind of won anyway. Because if you look at the actual constellation of issue positions, there's not an awful lot of difference between a business establishment Republican, a conservative Republican, and a Tea Party Republican, or even a religious or libertarian Republican. They kind of look the same. Now, there's a slight attitudinal difference. So the Tea Party candidates would tend to say on their websites things like, if you elect me, I'm going to vote against that horrible Speaker John Boehner, and I'm going to vote against the whole House leadership because they give away too many things to the Democrats, okay? So there's an attitudinal and a behavioral difference, more so than there is actually a policy difference. And I think that's important going forward because, in fact, if the Republican establishment is a little bit less afraid of those guys, they might be every bit as conservative, but they may not allow them to shut down the government and do some of the things that have happened in the past. Yes.
So drawing back on something you said earlier, which is you get as few as 5% of the people turning out for congressional primaries. It sounds like the narrative in congressional primaries is directed at the party faithful, a small number, whereas the national dialogue is going to be much broader because they're trying to reach a much wider audience. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yes and no. You're absolutely right, and we think that the source of the current polarization in Congress is primaries, because they talk to 5% of the voting age population. The difference is that at the congressional level, almost every seat we now have in the United States Congress is a safe seat. The number of seats where the winning margin is 60% or more, that's a big margin, has increased historically. So what that means is we've got the tail wagging the dog here, right? You've got a very small number of voters in primaries, and they are actually deciding the general election because the congressional districts are drawn in such a way that most of the time only one party wins. There's just a handful of competitive seats. Usually, frankly, it's about 30 out of 435, to show you how small that is. Now, The easy way to say that, and a lot of reformers have talked about redistricting, which is a good thing to talk about. The problem with redistricting is that it's very hard to draw competitive districts. Why? Because modern Americans vote with their feet, and they like to live near people like them. So if you're a gay couple in New York City, you're not going to move to Greenwich or Westchester. You're going to try to live in the Lower East Side, okay? You're going to try to live a place where people are like you. And that is happening all across the board, whether it's fundamentalist Christians, they seek out communities with other fundamentalist Christians. Whether it's gay and lesbian Americans, they seek out communities that are friendly to them. It's kind of natural, and now that we have a very mobile society, people do it. So what happens is you get these concentrations of conservatives, concentrations of liberals, and even if you were to go to completely nonpartisan redistricting, okay, you might increase your competitive districts a little bit, but you probably wouldn't be able to increase them all that much. Now, the difference is in the presidential. And primary voters, Americans are smart, let's face it, they adjust their strategies. So in a congressional race, you can vote your ideology. You know, you can vote for the person who's the most extreme, who makes you sing, right? Whether you're on the left or on the right. On the left or on the right. In a presidential, because presidential elections have tended to be competitive, in fact, when we poll primary voters in presidential elections, they do something that doesn't seem to happen in congressional. They take into account, can this person win? So if we look back at the spring of 2012, you had Newt Gingrich having a renaissance. You had all these candidates in the Republican Party. Everybody's dumping on Mitt Romney. But when you ask those primary voters, who do you think could best beat Barack Obama? They all said Mitt Romney. And some pollsters say that's a better measure, who do you think can beat the other side, than even who do you like. And so in presidential elections, we see primary voters looking ahead to the general and maybe not voting for the person that makes them most enthusiastic, but voting for a person they think can win. In the vast majority of congressional elections, you don't have to do that. Nobody has to do it. And hence, we have a lot of polarization in the Congress. Yeah, Ray?
Because this doesn't happen in the Northeast, I think your audience might be interested in describing what the experiment that's going on in California. I don't think a lot of folks are aware of what they've done to their primary system and the impact.
Yeah. Wow, it's a great question. Washington State and California are now using what's called a blanket primary. The theory is, or was, that all this partisan stuff turns off voters, and that's why they don't turn out, okay? And that they don't like this stuff, and that's why they don't turn out. And so if you just let everybody run in one primary, and you took the top two, that those two people would go to the general election, and this would transform the system. Good try. So far, in fact, turnout in California is the lowest it's ever been. All right, so far, this is not working. Now, there is something to be said for kind of letting this play out a bit, because you can see a situation where take a district that is really a Republican district. Under the current system, a moderate Republican can't win a Republican primary. Under a blanket primary, a moderate Republican could come in number 2 in the primary to, say, a Tea Party or more conservative Republican, and then get to the general election ballot and maybe get some Democratic votes and maybe win the seat. We're just beginning to see that happen. We saw it happen this year with the race in the South, where African Americans crossed over to vote for Thad Cochran. because compared to the other guy, Thad Cochran was a wonderful liberal. And African Americans said, yeah, we're going to help Thad Cochran, okay? So this kind of thing can happen. It's not happening yet. And we're kind of, there's so many adjustments, like the candidates have to figure out how this system works. The voters have to figure out how this system works. And the question is whether or not it'll survive long enough to actually change anything. Right now, people are kind of pretty unhappy with it because they just think it's not doing what it was meant to do.
Last cycle, there were two Democrats that ran against you, ended up both making it through the primary. What happened to those Republicans? Was there a lower Republican turnout in California in that congressional district because they simply said there's nobody there for me to vote for? Or did they mostly side with one of the other candidates?
There's some scholars at Berkeley looking at this, and mostly what they're finding is that Republicans come out and they vote for the R's, and Democrats come out and vote for the D's. And so the difference is in the handful of districts where you end up with two D's or two R's going into the general election ballot. It's almost like a primary and then another primary. But you haven't, all we've seen is lower turnout across the board. I don't know the answer to that specifically, but that'd be a good one to look at. We're just beginning to study these because a lot of people are kind of interested in this idea of the blanket primary, and they want to know how it works, et cetera. And I think a lot of politicians are still kind of scratching their heads saying, how do I calculate my odds in this scenario? Yes?
On the blanket primary, it's very interesting. You seem to think that talking that turnout is the key question, but if turnout's the same, but you end up with more moderate folks elected who can get something done, maybe I don't care about turnout.
Well, I mean, the idea behind the blanket primary was both. It would increase turnout and that you would get more moderates elected. And so far, it hasn't done either. Okay, so far it hasn't done either. But then again, it's a very new experiment. So I'm not sure how long it will go. California, by the way, has this habit, because they have a referendum, California has this habit of changing things around all the time. So, they had nonpartisan redistricting for a couple cycles. Then they went back to having partisan redistricting. Now they're back to nonpartisan redistricting. And, the problem for us political scientists is that they don't stick with anything long enough for us to see how it works.
That's good for business.
Yes, good for business. One more question? Sure.
You would mention you have the two-party system, the Democrats and Republicans. What about the independents?
They don't get elected?
The independents in the primaries voting.
Well,
Just a large percentage of the independents in the country.
so in 11 states in the United States, independents cannot vote in a primary, okay? Because you have to register with a political party.
You actually have to take one. I had to take one of the either Republican
Or the Democratic ballot.
I had to sign the form.
Right. Most of the other states now, you can in fact choose a ballot, pick a ballot. And independents, there are, when we survey independents, which we've been doing for many, many years, it's a little bit of misnomer. There aren't many real independents. There are independent Democrats and independent Republicans. There are people who call themselves independents, but who in fact, if you then go into their voting records, they mostly vote Republicans, they mostly vote Democrats. And so the real issue, say in a given state, say in a Senate race, right, is, okay, how many independent Republicans out there, how many independent Democrats are there? Once you figure that out, you're left with about 8% maybe of the electorate. And they can be the swing, absolutely. They can be the swing vote in a state. A lot of independents tend not to vote in primaries. A lot of true independents, they just skip the primaries, which is true of a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans don't vote in primaries. And one of the things that I've advocated and the Bipartisan Policy Center has advocated is that we maybe should start thinking of a national primary day. One of the reasons that nobody votes in primaries is nobody knows they're happening. You don't, I mean, it is hard even for a conscientious citizen to know when your primary is. They take place over a period of time, starting in March, all the way to the beginning of September. We just had the last ones with Massachusetts and Florida last week, and New Hampshire last week. Yeah, so they go through this period of time. It's almost like we have a perfect storm here, because over this period of time when primaries have become so important, districts have become so safe, making primaries even more important. The other thing that's happened is that the local press in many communities is disappearing. The number of state house reporters in the state has dropped by half in the last decade. Nobody is covering local politics. So think of the vicious circle, right? Nobody covers it. If nobody's covering it, how are ordinary citizens going to even remember that there's a primary happening? They don't remember there's a primary happening. They don't vote. Turnout is extremely low. The most motivated segment of the electorate, the most passionate segment of the electorate, therefore gets to control the primary. And in a vast number of districts, that's the election. The primary is the election. There we have it, a polarized United States. So on that unhappy note, thank you for listening to this, and good luck to all of you.
Once again, on behalf of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics and St. Anselm College, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight.
Fabulous. Good. Thank you so much.